Thank you, Martha. So now I'd like to introduce first Jan van de Breckel. He's an extended professor of survey methodology at Maastricht University. Previously, he worked at Statistics Netherlands, working on design-based inference methods for randomized experiments embedded in probability samples and coordinating research on model-based inference methods. His research interests are sampling, design, and analysis of experiments, small area estimation, time series analysis, and statistical methods for measuring the effects of designs of repeated surveys. He holds a master's in biometrics and a PhD in statistics. We also have Annemieke Luiten, who is a senior methodologist at Statistics Netherlands with a specialty in data collection methodology. Her research areas comprise non-response reduction, fieldwork, interviewer behavior, mixed mode surveys, and the role of sensor measurement in surveys. She holds a master's in psychology and a PhD in survey methodology. And last but certainly not least, we have Barry Schouten, is a professor at Utrecht University. He holds a special chair on mixed mode survey designs and has worked at the methodology department of Statistics Netherlands, focusing on research on primary data collection and non-response reduction and adjustment to multi-mode surveys, measurement error, and adaptive survey designs. Since 2017, he's one of the coordinators of a joint data collection innovation network, WIN in Dutch, between Statistics Netherlands and Utrecht University that was established in 2016. He has a master's and PhD in mathematics. So I will be turning it over to, I believe, Jan is presenting first.
No, I will start the presentation. So,
oh, sorry.
No problem. Thanks, Sarah, and also Marta and Amanda for inviting us to this DC-AAPOR Book Club. It's really an honor for us to be here. We're also very proud about the book. I think it took us maybe 3 years to write it. And if you would look at the graph of pages that we wrote in time, originally the expected time of arrival would be 2035. But somewhere during Corona, I think we found the right spirit and we managed to finish the book just in time for this summer. So you see there are 6 authors today in the meeting. We have 4 of them present, 2 others are not here, or maybe they are listening, but they're not visible to you. All authors are actually employed at Statistics Netherlands, and they represent the different areas of mixed mode. So that's why we are so proud that we managed to combine all of these different areas into one book. So, okay, Jan, please go ahead. So what we'll do today is, of course, a little bit of background why this book. And then we move to the 2 main parts of the book, the design and the analysis. And then we end up with a bit of lighter stuff, the future developments. Okay, next, please. Okay, so let's first start why or why not we wrote this book. Next, please, Jan. Yeah, I guess it's not very good advertisement to start why you would not write a book like this, but it's actually quite important to stress this. We hesitated for quite some time to write a book like this because it's really very complicated area. You could say that modes probably affect almost any aspect of a survey design, if not all errors in an error framework, if you would look at it. And not just small impact, but quite big impact. And then on the other side, of course, also cost is heavily affected by modes. Then the second reason why it's not so easy is that essentially modes are just ways of communication, and they change all the time. So I think while writing this book, the amount of smartphone responses already increased by maybe 5% at the Statistics Netherlands. And maybe the final reason is that, mixed mode is, while from a methodology point of view, is really very interesting to look at quality of the survey, it really mostly is driven by cost. So there is not that much time or budget to actually go into detail. And so why write a book about quality if it's often driven by cost? And maybe the last and not least reason, there is already a very, very good book, frequently cited, maybe it's one of the most frequently cited books in methodology. So why another book? So please go ahead, Jan.
Sorry, my keyboard is very slow. It doesn't, I tried to press, but it doesn't react.
Okay.
I don't understand why.
You can already start pressing while I'm talking.
Yeah, and then it works directly.
So why did we write a book? Okay, so Statistics Netherlands, we did stress a book on official surveys. That's quite a big difference between surveys in general, I guess. Statistics Netherlands was probably one of the statistical institutes that started earliest. We also made the most mistakes, I guess, because of that. And that of course you can learn a lot from it. So I think we started around 2005, 2006, migrating the first large-scale population surveys to mixed mode. And by now there is no survey left that is not mixed mode. So it really has changed all over our program. Another reason is that mixed modes are becoming more and more omnipresent. And I think that the recent COVID pandemic actually also was a stimulus for this. Mixed modes can be more robust. So you have more options, you could say, more levers to try. And what we also lacked was a overview that covers both design and analysis. So the book by Don Dillman, for example, and colleagues is mostly about design. It's not so much about estimation. And we thought that would be a good contribution of our book. Okay. So the book has 5 parts, and we are not going to discuss them in detail. There should be, of course, something left for you to read. So we'll focus mostly on the design and analysis parts of the book, which we also think are the most important parts. Next, please. So before I hand over to Annemieke and Jan, it's good to say a few words about mode effects. So the term mode effects comes up all the time, and I guess the intuition of most would be that it's something about if you change mode, you get different statistics. But it's not that simple. So there are as many mode effects as you can think of errors. So there's a coverage effect, there's a selection effect in terms of non-response, there might be measurement differences and all that. Furthermore, it's mode effect doesn't exist if you don't specify what you're trying to estimate, what is the population of interest, and how you're going to estimate it. So in one particular survey, you could have many mode effects, and they could be small or big at the same time. And finally, maybe it's also good to state that the mode effects, they were already there. It's not like they did not exist, but now when we're going mixed mode, they become more and more visible. And that's, of course, when you start comparing different subgroups in time or across domains, that become quite tricky. So we try in the book to also clarify the meaning of mode effect. We try to define it and try to estimate it and, of course, impact, influence. Okay, so the first way to go and influence mode effects is through the design, probably the most important stage of a survey. So I'll hand over to Annemieke.
Thank you, Barry. Jan, you can, yes, okay. Well, like Barry said, one of the, perhaps the most important decision when implementing a mixed mode design is which modes to use, and also which combination of modes, and not unimportantly, which sequence of the modes you are going to use. For example, are you going to use them sequentially, one after the other, or are you going to use them concurrently at the same time? And we're looking in the book into the implications, not only for response. A lot of literature mostly focus on response rates, but we explicitly also look at sample composition, data quality, and the cost. Well, once you decide that you should include a web mode in your mix, it obviously makes sense to try to increase the web response as highly as you can. There's a large part in the book on communication strategies and also on incentive strategies. I'm going to say a little bit more about that later. And finally, it's very important, obviously, and then we're in the topic of measurement errors, measurement effects, to look into your questionnaire design. That for mixed mode is an entirely, well, not entirely, but it's a different topic than for just a single mode questionnaire design. Okay. When we started doing research into mixed mode effects, we had this kind of vision that perhaps there was a best mixed mode design. And we started an inventory among European countries, also, by the way, some non-European countries in the beginning, of the modes and mode combinations that were used in a number of large European surveys. And what we found was that there are a lot of different mode and mode combination within one and the same survey. And also that one and the same country can use all kinds of different mode and mode combinations across their surveys. So there were even a number of countries that used 5 different mode combinations for the 6 surveys that are described here. And we concluded, I think, that there is no such thing as the best mixed mode design. Circumstances like the complexity of the subject matter, the survey length, the kind of sample, the panel structure, they all influence what could be the optimal mixed mode design for any given survey. Okay. No? The tension mounts. Okay. There is quite some literature on the topic of how to do this order. Should we offer concurrent or sequential mixed mode orders? But the literature is rather inconclusive as to the effects on at least the response rate. Nevertheless, more than half of the European NSIs use a concurrent design, probably with the view of respondent friendliness. But a concurrent design has a risk of lower response rates. It also limits the possibility of cost savings, and it has far more complicated logistics and planning. However, we also found in the literature, and to be sure, I'm not sure if all our NSIs actually do that, but all these risks can be counteracted by a careful survey design. Well, another topic where the literature is inconclusive is if you have a sequential design, what sequence will you use? Will you start with the cheapest mode and then do the more expensive mode, or do you do it the other way around? And also, when do you introduce this next mode? Well, again, the literature is inconclusive, I already said so, but I also saw that there were large differences in the designs and populations of all the various contributions to literature, and so that may also cause why literature is inconclusive. One thing we did find is that longer delays offer opportunity for larger cost savings, mostly because you have the time to offer more reminders, but that's not very interesting, I think. Okay. We have, at Statistics Netherlands, put quite a lot of effort in the communication strategy to increase web response. Web surveys put a strain on communication because it's far more difficult to explain to the respondent what we expect of them. it's also more difficult to make them trust you. The only way you can do it is by this one letter, or perhaps a reminder. But you need to be as clear, as simple as possible. And trust me, it's very easy to be not as clear, as simple as possible. So you have to test. Well, mostly the European NSIs, I think other NSIs also, we don't have access to email registries or telephone registries. So we have to mail out these invitations. So a lot of work needs to be done into these letters. And also the number and the timing of the reminders. I think when you have a web-only or even a mail-only questionnaire, you could perhaps send out 3-4 reminders. But if you have a mixed mode design, that is not so good if your interviewer arrives at the doorstep and the respondent who has just received 5 reminders will be rather mad, I think, at you. And the interviewer will get the brunt of that. So not too many. We have done a large series of experiments with letters, with flyers, with envelopes, and we still continue to do that. It's a continuous experimental series on the labor force survey where we structurally have a small part of the sample where we can do this experiment. So it's very, very worthwhile. An important finding is that regretfully we find large subgroup differences in results, and it's only rarely that we write a letter or develop a flyer that is equally appreciated in all subgroups. So it's often that you see, well, basically no overall results, but very large subgroup differences that would, well, perhaps plead for an adaptive design. Okay.
I try at the point to operate the keyboard with a hammer, but yeah.
Okay. Well, although these letters and these flyers are very, very important, their effect is by far not so large as using incentives. Well, typically NSIs did not use incentives, but since the onset of web questionnaires, we see a large increase in the use of incentives. And we give an overview of the effect of incentives in general on response rates, cost, sample composition, and data quality. We also give an overview of the incentives used in European NSIs. Well, it's illustrative. It's large differences between pens and, well, iPads like we do. But I think the most important part here is an overview of the incentives that we have done in Statistics Netherlands with all kinds of incentives in mixed mode conditions, both unconditional, conditional incentives, and also lottery incentives. Perhaps in contrast to the literature, we found that a lottery incentive works very well for us, and it has become our incentive of choice in all, well, most of our surveys. Okay, Jan. So now I'm coming to the topic of questionnaire design. It's a very important part in our toolkits to prevent mode-specific measurement effects. And the goal is obviously to design questionnaires that measure the concept and variables in the various modes that are used in the survey. We found more and more that if one of the modes is CAWI, is web, a mixed mode questionnaire design will probably also mean a mixed device questionnaire design, because people will try to fill in your web questionnaire on their smartphones more and more. So what you see here is a brief overview of the chapter. We discuss how questionnaire design can affect mode-specific measurement errors. We then discuss what to think about when designing a mixed mode questionnaire, what elements are relevant and what you all need to think about. Finally, this also includes a list of criteria to assess if a questionnaire is fit for smartphone use. Okay. Well, questionnaire design, you will know it is an iterative process. We have learned that mixed mode requirements should be considered at each stage. For example, if you already see at the stage of conceptualization that we will have a questionnaire with a focus on sensitive topics that are likely subject to social desirability bias, it's advisable not to mix an interviewer mode with a non-interviewer mode. Or what you could do if you could use a web CAPI design and plan for a CASI part in CAPI. At Statistics Netherlands, we have moved to designing the questionnaire for all modes simultaneously in one file, instead of working for one file for CAPI-CATI, one file for mode, for example, for web, for example. So now it's all in one file. That's far more efficient, less error prone, and also important, the designers immediately are sensitive to all the relevant modes in the design process. There's a lot of attention also in the book on questionnaire testing for mixed mode questions. Ideally, you test on all the modes and devices that you're going to use. This may, however, not also always be feasible in practice. So we discuss strategies for mixed mode and mixed device testing, like, for example, well, if you're in a pickle, try at least to focus on the modes with the highest risk of mode effects. For example, smartphones with their small screen, or CATI with their more or less unnatural timing of the conversation. Okay, that was my contribution. Jan, over to you.
Okay, so another part of the book is about analysis of mixed mode surveys. And the book has 3 chapters that talks about analysis issues. The first one is how to design and analyze large-scale field tests to estimate differences on survey estimates that are a result of different modes, and how to implement a mixed mode survey in a repeated ongoing survey. We also have a chapter on re-interview designs that with the purpose to disentangle mode effects and also to adjust for mode effects in the analysis of mixed mode designs. And we have a chapter on inference methods for mixed mode surveys. So the first chapter, it talks about field tests and the implementation of mixed mode surveys. From the context of official statistics, most national statistical institutes conduct repeated surveys. And the very value aspect of that is that it enables us to build uninterrupted time series that describe the evolution of all kinds of parameters of interest. Now, if you implement a mixed mode survey in an ongoing survey, you have to change the questionnaire and also all kinds of fieldwork strategies. And that will change the setting of a lot of measurement errors and also selection bias errors. And that will become visible as a shock in the outcomes of your ongoing survey. And that is what is here further called discontinuities. And in this figure, you see an example of that. It comes from the Dutch crime victimization survey. In the period until 2004, data collection of this survey was completely based on face-to-face interviewing. And in 2005, a mixed mode design that is based on telephone interviewing and face-to-face interviewing was implemented. And a main part of the shock that you see is actually because of the change in measurement bias and selection effects. So an important part of the implementation of a mixed mode design in an ongoing survey is to quantify these kind of discontinuities in order to avoid confounding real period-to-period changes from differences in measurement and selection bias that are the result of the implementation of a mixed mode design. And in this chapter, we talk about 3 different ways to do that. The most important one is to conduct large-scale field tests, but alternatively, you can also consider time series methods, or if there is no possibility to do a field test, or if there is only budget for a small test, about small area estimation methods. Now, starting with the field tests, a field test obviously is the most reliable approach to quantify differences because of the change of the fieldwork organization of the implementation of a mixed mode design. But the success or the failure heavily depends on the preparation and the design of such a field test. So in this chapter, we talk about making clear choices about the purpose of an experiment, how to formalize hypotheses to be tested. Once you have made decisions on the hypothesis to be tested and the minimum difference that need to be observed at the specific power and significance level, how to calculate sample sizes. Another difficult thing in a survey organization is to plan the fieldwork to conduct a large-scale field experiment. So we also talk about that kind of issues. And finally, we talk about how to choose an efficient experimental design that is embedded in an ongoing survey, and how you can use the structures of the sample design to design a more efficient experimental design. Finally, we talk about if the purpose is to test hypotheses about differences in estimates of population parameters, then you might want to consider to use a design-based inference method to test these hypotheses. So we talk about design-based Wald tests and T-type test statistics to test hypotheses about finite differences in finite population parameters that are the result of different mode implementations. Once again, a correct conducted and designed field test is a very reliable approach to test differences in outcomes because of the implementation of a mixed mode design. But the drawback is that it is not very cost effective because it requires additional data collection. And on top of that, the implementation in the fieldwork organization can be very complex. So a field test is not always possible. So as a backup, we also talk about time series models that can be used to approximate the discontinuities that are the result of a survey redesign. So what you can do is to model the period-to-period changes of the parameter of interest with trends and seasonal components and maybe also auxiliary series, and model the changeover from the old to the new design with, for example, a level intervention. And after a few observations under the new design becomes available, this might also allow you to get a reasonable approximation of discontinuities. Now, the in-between situation is that there is only a limited budget to conduct a small experiment, which might be sufficient to estimate discontinuities at the national level, but for example, not to estimate discontinuities for the planned domains. In that case, for this kind of situations, we talk about small area estimation methods that are designed to analyze this kind of experiments. So what you see, for example, as an example in these two figures that are actually the results of an experiment, of a field test or a parallel run that is conducted for the redesign of a crime victimization survey. Here in the field test, we compare the regular survey that is used for regular publication purposes. So it's conducted at this planned sample size of, say, 60,000 persons. And the parallel run, or the experimental group, there was only budget for 6,000 observations. So now what you see in the left panel, that are the direct estimates of the regular survey on the x-axis, and the design, the GREC estimates, the design-based estimates on the y-axis for the experimental survey, the old design. And yeah, due to the small sample size of the experimental group, yeah, the estimates, yeah, based on the GREC estimator, they're all over the place. If there is no discontinuity, yeah, all estimates should be concentrated around this 45 degrees line. But yeah, due to large sampling errors, particularly in the experimental group, yeah, some estimates or some domains you see that the regular survey is higher compared to the experimental group, and some it's the other way around. But if you combine both estimates, for example, in a bivariate multi-level model, then the small sample, then the estimates of the small experimental group heavily benefit of the large sample size of the regular survey. And as you see here, yeah, the estimates become more concentrated and show a consistent pattern that the estimates under the regular survey are larger than under the experimental approach. So we briefly touch upon this kind of analysis methods for field tests. Then in the second chapter, we talk about re-interview designs with the purpose to disentangle mode effects, and also with the purpose to adjust in your estimates for mode effects. So roughly spoken, mode effects can be decomposed in mode-specific measurement bias and mode-specific selection bias. And the field tests that we just discussed, yeah, they are appropriate to estimate the net effect in measurement bias and selection bias if you change from one mode to another. But if you're interested in to disentangle measurement bias and selection bias, that requires a re-interview design. This is an example of that. So this is a re-interview design of an experimental setup with the purpose to estimate differences between different modes with a golden standard, which is here called the CAAPI mode, and to estimate mode-specific measurement errors and mode-specific selection bias. So it starts with a sample that is randomly divided over, in this case, 4 different modes. You get some response under each mode and some non-response, and both groups are re-interviewed after a while using a golden standard, which was here chosen to be the CAAPI mode, but that can be, of course, a different mode. And we talk here about estimation methods to estimate relative differences in the measurement bias between these modes versus CAAPI, and relative selection bias differences between these modes and the CAAPI mode. The chapter also talks about another type of re-interview designs with the purpose to adjust in your estimation for mode effects. Now, what you see here is a typical setup, is an overview of a typical setup of a standard sequential mixed mode design. So in the first approach, the sample is approached under mode M1, and yeah, the gray shaded box shows the response under mode M1, but of course there is some non-response under this mode. It is the box B in white. And these non-respondents are approached again in a follow-up using a different mode, M2. And again, you get some response, which is here in the shaded box. And there will always be some non-response that's left over. Now, in the standard design-based estimators, treat the responses under both modes equally. But if you want to adjust in your estimate for differences in measurement bias between mode M1 and M2, you could consider this kind of a re-interview design, where actually the respondents in the first approach are re-approached using the mode that is used for the follow-up. And in this chapter, we also talk about estimation methods that correct for the relative measurement bias between the first and the second mode. Finally, we have a chapter on mixed mode data analysis. So standard inference methods like the Roberts-Thompson estimator or the general regression estimator and calibration estimators, they assume that observations are observed without error. And if you have highly correlated auxiliary information, then these estimators correct, at least partially, for selective non-response. Now, in a sequential mixed mode design for repeated surveys, we already saw that the implementation might result in discontinuities that you might want to quantify. But again, in a repeated survey, once a mixed mode design is implemented, the distribution over the modes of the samples of the sampling units over the modes in the subsequent editions of this mixed mode design can also vary, particularly in sequential mixed mode designs. So that still gives rise to variation in the measurement bias between the subsequent editions of a mixed mode survey. And the question addressed in this chapter is, are these standard weighting methods still appropriate? And in this chapter, we talk about two different ways to accommodate for mode-specific measurement bias. The first approach are methods known in the literature that attempt to correct for methods. So you have to choose a preferred mode as the benchmark. And you can, using these estimators, try to adjust for the relative differences in measurement bias between these modes. Contrary to the re-interview designs discussed in the previous chapter, this kind of methods do not require a re-interview. Another approach where we talk about is not to correct for measurement bias, but try to balance the mode distribution in your estimator, which is achieved by calibrating or weight the response in the sample to an assumed fixed distribution of your population over the modes. So this is a method that does not correct for measurement bias, but it intends to keep the measurement bias constant, such that at least the period-to-period changes remain unbiased. Now, finally, all these three chapters, the analysis methods that are discussed are illustrated with real-life applications to the Dutch labor force survey, the crime victimization survey, and the health survey. And we also illustrate them with simulations. So this is so far my contribution. Now I give it over to Deidre.
No, it's back to me, Jan.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, also given the time a little bit, I think I'll go through this very quickly, so there's time left for some questions and discussion. So can you click, can you go next, Jan? So yeah, obviously, an important question is, once we wrote this book, is there still a future for mixed mode surveys? And yeah, we do believe that there is definitely a future, but it's probably going to look quite different, and it's going to change probably all the time. In the book, we briefly discuss of the areas where we think mixed mode surveys are going, and if we ever dare to write a new edition of this book, then probably these topics will come in as important, hopefully. I just wanted to talk about one of them, the last one, smart surveys, which is where we have a lot of effort at our office nowadays. So smart surveys, they go a step further than, let's say, traditional surveys. They also try to use existing data, sensor data, measurements, all that kind of additional kind of sources that are not necessarily questions. And here you see the dashboard where you would come into the household budget survey. There's questionnaires on the left. You are trying to fill in a questionnaire right now. So of course it's very small, but it's just to give you an idea. But at the same time, can you move ahead, Jan? At the same time, it can be synchronized with an application that can do both manual data entry, so you can enter products and price and all that, but it can also scan receipts, or you would upload digital receipts, which it can then process sort of semi-automatically. And this is a European project in which some of the countries use this app, and then in sequence they still allow for paper diaries, or you would be allowed to go for an online with questionnaire. So this is sort of a new type of mixed mode survey where it's not just questions, but it's also sort of sensor or app assistant. Okay, so yeah, last page, yeah. And in the same kind of surveys, they also offer feedback instantaneously. So you get these overviews of what you've been doing. You can get some insights on where you spend most of the money. It's also possible to delay these kind of insights to the end of data collection in order not to affect people. So this is sort of the new kind of mixed mode surveys, you could say, that we're trying right now. And I guess it's probably, again, we're going to make a lot of mistakes, and that might be good reason to write them down and inform you about this. So final sheet, Jan. So yeah, with that, we'd like to thank you for listening. Again, we were very honored that you allowed us to present the book. I listed just 3 of the authors' email addresses, so we're very happy to answer any questions if there's not enough time during this session. Okay, so now I open it up for questions.
Thank you. So I'm going to start with Martha's question, and anybody who wrote in a question, feel free to unmute and ask it yourself so that you can follow up. But I feel like I'm putting Martha on the spot to do that, so I can also read her question. For the discontinuity shown by changing the fieldwork strategy, how do you know that it wasn't a jump in offenses? There appeared to be a jump in a previous year when all research was done face-to-face. Was this because of the mixed mode you could analyze differences found across the 2 modes?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, in this case, I think, if you refer to the first figure I showed, there was no field test. So to rule out this kind of uncertainty or questions, it's really important to do a kind of a field test where you compare the old and the new design in parallel. Well, the variable that was analyzed in that graph, that was actually the number of offenses against the Dutch population. So we have some additional auxiliary information that comes from police registrations that also confirmed that this jump was more a difference in motive, measurement bias and selection bias than a real evolution. So we could establish that conclusion with, in this case, the evolution of police registration data. But yeah, particularly your question shows actually the reason that it is important do a field test.
And I have a follow-up question, which is the benefit of emceeing. I could do that, which is I've had experiences where we were switching modes between surveys, like multiple cross-sectional surveys. And is there a way to distinguish between, as you mentioned, there's differences in how questions are asked, like the measurement, and then also differences in the sample. So for example, who might be willing to answer a phone survey is going to be different from who's comfortable enough taking a survey on the web.
I do not directly have an answer for an experimental design to that, but that requires, I guess, a more advanced experimental setup to figure these different factors out. And so in the most simple case, you have a kind of a two treatment experiment, but in this kind of cases, you should think more in maybe factorial designs, setups, and to look into the effects of quantifying the contributions of different underlying factors. I'm not sure whether this answers your question, but.
Thank you. We have a question from Andy Christian. What are your thoughts on using natural language processing and more open-ended questioning?
Well, I can try say a few words about it. This is also, it's just a broad question, but also very specific at the same time. But we, in these app-based studies that I was just mentioning, we use natural language processing to read receipts, essentially. We extracted text from the receipts, but we also start exploring open-ended answers in time use surveys and try to classify them to specified categories. But I think in more general terms, natural language processing, maybe this is more a question for my colleague Deirdre, whether we would use them in general questionnaires. It is a bit tricky because you need quite a bit of training, pre-training before you would go live in production, I guess. But we use it in the app studies.
Maybe I can add that specifically for business surveys, we are now looking into using it for the remarks people make in the questionnaires, and also for the complaints and questions they send into our help desk. Because there's lots of interesting information there that we don't analyze as well yet as we could theoretically. And of course, it is a lot of work, but then the benefit is that we have lots of data that has already been coded, so it looks promising. And I think maybe in a year or so, we will have more results on that.
Okay. May Cooper asks, given the changing nature of the web, how much of the problem do you think changing attitudes might be to the assumption that mode effects will be similar over time? For instance, if people trust the web less over time, that may change the rate at which they report sensitive topics.
Yeah, we didn't really agree who would answer what question, but I can give a first go. It's definitely true that this changes all the time, with cybercrime and all these kind of things that are reported. These attitudes probably change. The mode effect, again, of course, this is actually a multitude of errors, and we've always assumed that measurement differences, so the pure mode effects, don't change very quickly, so they are slow. They change so slowly, so you would every now and then have to check whether that is a true assumption. I'm not sure if the others have anything to say to add to that.
Yeah, but what already has been emphasized in the presentation is also that this also applied to a single mode design that uses web interviewing, but there you don't see it. But there you have to make similar assumptions to compare estimates over time.
Okay, thank you. And Jessica Holzberg asks, have you had any experiences where there was a lot of scrutiny or concerns about breaks in time series from government officials or data users? how did you handle messaging around that and convincing stakeholders a mixed mode approach was the right way forward in the long term?
Well, that's a nice question. Actually, try to go up. This example is about the number of offenses against the Dutch population. And in 2004, we actually were, Statistics Netherlands was faced with budget cuts. And that was the reason that there was no budget for a parallel run. So we, without thinking about discontinuities, we implemented a cheaper data collection mode. But we did not realize that our Ministry of Justice had a policy in place that was focused on improving safety in the Netherlands. So when we published this first result, our Minister of Justice and Internal Affairs was not quite amused that despite the fact that they had a very strong policy in place to reduce crime victimization in the Netherlands, that there was a huge increase. So it can be sensitive, and yeah, Statistics Netherlands was not really aware of that, but our director of household service have to give account of these change, or yeah, these strange evolutions in the figures to our Minister of Justice and Internal Affairs. So yeah, sometimes data users are very aware of these kind of breaks, and I think comparability over time is one of the most important quality aspects of repeated official statistics. Is that more or less answering the question? Oh yeah, and how do you handle messaging around stakeholders? We recently implemented a new design in our labor force survey, and what worked pretty well is that we announced half a year or a year in advance that we are going to redesign our labor force survey, and that users should expect discontinuities. And once we announced that timely in advance, and also promised that we at least quantify these discontinuities, it is not really a problem as it was in this example with our crime victimization survey.
The next question, does your book cover dealing with selection and measurement error and adaptive survey design?
Yeah, there's one chapter devoted to adaptive survey designs that, yeah, if you talk about modes, then by definition you have to think about measurement differences. So it tries to, yeah. But I would say there's more to say about it. Yeah. This is chapter 11, I think, or yeah. Mm-hmm.
Could you, Jonathan Mendelson asked, could you please talk a bit more about what your interpretation of the research regarding the sequential versus concurrent design choice, which just was described as inconclusive? Any thoughts regarding Medway and Fulton's 2012 meta-analysis on the topic?
Is that this one here?
Yeah, that's me. Well, it all depends. I would say also on your starting mode, on your on the different modes that you use, and that makes the data inconclusive, I think, because I was trying to do a similar, well, not a meta-analysis like they did, but trying to just make an overview of the literature and the positive and negative findings in each of the experiments. And at a certain moment, I thought, well, I'm not getting there anywhere because there are too many differences in all these experimental designs for me to make a conclusion there. So yes, I was a little bit disappointed to be having to tell you all the time that literature is inclusive, but yeah, that's the fact, I'm afraid.
Thanks. Just a follow up, Jessica Holzberg is
Yeah,
responding, saying there's an AAPOR presentation or paper, sorry. So that might be good for everyone to
see
look
as
out.
strong a pattern as Metway Fulton. Okay, I was not aware of that paper, but that would concur with my my own interpretation that well, it's not as clear cut as we thought.
So we have two final
Oh,
questions.
yes.
I don't know if
I love the first question.
is that one from Andy Christensen on if one had to conduct a survey where the design and analysis had to be implemented at the same time, what would be the most important evaluation testing tools? Or did you want to answer the question about lottery incentives?
Yes, I was going to answer the question on lottery incentives.
Okay, sorry, Andy, we're going to circle back. We'll circle back to Andy's. Sarah Grady asked, any theory on why lottery incentives works well for the Netherlands counter to literature?
Well, this strategy that we have that is actually based on 3 findings in literature where lottery incentives did work. I can't remember off the top of my head which experiments it were, but there were 3 that said, well, if you do this, your prize needs to be large. Second said, if you do this, the fact that you're having this lottery must be very salient. And 3, if you do this, try and let people know right away that they won. And these 3 things we do all the time. That's what we do, all 3. So large prize is the iPad, or nowadays we use people can choose. They can also get the money, let's say. So that's 400 euros, something like that. It's quite a lot. And right after they fill in the questionnaire, we let them know you won this iPad, or regretfully, well, most of the time, you did not win this iPad. So that is, I think, the magic formula to make this work. The first time we did this, we did this in a sample with young persons, and there we did a lottery of iPad minis, and we had an increase in web response of 12 percentage points. That's huge.
Yeah.
For a lottery. Yeah. So in the general population, it is a little bit less, but it still works very well.
So it's 1 p.m. DC time, so I'm going to be respectful of everyone's time. I'm going to, if we can try to stay a little bit later to answer Andy's question, but I'm going to kick it to Martha to announce the book club winner.
Yes, so that was a pretty good transition from, hey, if you let lottery winners know right away. So the winner of the book club giveaway is Casey Tesfaye. So thank you very much for attending. We will be in touch about giving away the book. And then the next book club event is going to be with Claire Bowen on her book, Protecting Your Privacy in a Data-Driven World. And that will be on Wednesday, August 24th from noon to 1 p.m. Eastern time. Yes, thank you again, everyone, for attending. And we will also be emailing you shortly a short survey to ask for feedback on the book club as we continue this series.